The debate on the motion, be it resolved that Parliament authorizes the Minister for Finance to borrow the sum of US $29 million by way of a rapid credit facility loan from the International Monetary Fund for the purpose of capital and recurrent expenditure. The loan is repayable at a 0% interest rate inclusive of a 5.5-year grace period with a final maturity of 10 years and semi-annually through a standing authorization to the International Monetary Fund to debit St. Lucia's XDR account with the amount of all financial obligations to the International Monetary Fund for the Rapid Credit Facility loan as the financial obligations fall due. Yet to the Prime Minister, the Honorable Prime Minister and Minister for Finance, Economic Growth, Job Creation, External Affairs and the Public Service will table the Citizenship by Investment Amendment Bill for the first reading. We await the commencement of the House. We'll be continuing the discussion on the motion. We have yet to hear from a number of MPs who will be presenting their case as well as indicating whether they support the motion or not. Please stay with the broadcast. We are soon to commence.
Honorable members, please be reminded that a question before the House that Parliament authorizes the Minister of Finance to borrow the sum of SDR 21,400,000 or US 29 million by way of a rapid credit facility loan from the International Monetary Fund for the purpose of capital and recurrent expenditure. B, the loan is repayable at a 0% interest rate inclusive of a 5.5-year grace period with a final maturity of 10 years. And 2, semi-annually through a standing authorization to the International Monetary Fund to debit St. Lucia's XDR account with the amount of all financial obligations to the International Monetary Fund for the rapid credit facility loan as the financial obligations fall due. Member for Castres North.
Yep. Thank you, sir. Good. Excellent. Mr. Speaker, the matter before us is one which seeks to grant approval by Parliament for the government to borrow the sum of SDR special drawing rights of $21,400,000 or US $29 million by way of what is known to be the rapid credit facility from the International Monetary Fund. It clearly states that the purpose for which this money is being borrowed is to undertake capital and recurrent expenditure. Mr. Speaker, it is interesting that at this time that the government of St. Lucia has found the need to come to the Parliament to present this very important resolution or motion seeking the support of the entire House. And that is being done, Mr. Speaker, at a time when St. Lucia is facing safely the worst socio-economic challenge ever in our history. In fact, it is said that this crisis or pandemic, which has social and economic implications, is certainly worse than the economic crisis of 2007-2008, when the world reeled under the global financial meltdown. And so, Mr. Speaker, it is important to understand the backdrop and the basis for this application or for this resolution based on the conditions which present themselves to us at this time. In fact, if I were to allude to some of the comments made this morning, and I call the high points or the sound bites, I must admit that if what was said this morning, Mr. Speaker, is anything close to what the intention of the government is at this time, whether it is to pass a resolution for the introduction of the emergency powers, which I don't necessarily support a 4-month, I may say a 2-month, but I also understand if you have it for 4 months, you can suspend it at any time. But even if we were supposed to go by some of the sound bites, such as the intention of the government is to stifle the people's rights and the people's freedom, I will not be part of that government or this government, if that is the intention. If the intention is government is using emergency powers and to shield for self-gain, I will not be part of that government. Government is flexing its state muscle to protect itself. If that is the intention, I cannot be part of that government. They have joined the Prime Minister to suppress the people. If indeed that is the case, I cannot be part of the government. Treatment of workers at the ports, etc., Mr. Speaker, I cannot be part of a government if that is true. And so I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, I understand the anxiety that may be permeating through the minds of many. I can understand that anxiety. I can understand the expectation. I can understand how people may think at this time on the foothills of an election. But I'll also say, Mr. Speaker, when I listen to the messages and the body language of some members, it seemed to me that we are being placed in the same bracket or within the same environment as what appears to be taking place in a sister island in the region. And again I say, Mr. Speaker, if this government were to adopt a posture of using emergency powers to cover up and to hide under the darkness of those powers, to even think of calling an election, Mr. Speaker, I cannot be part of this government. Because, Mr. Speaker, I believe in freedom and democracy. I believe in transparency. I believe in accountability, Mr. Speaker. And I also believe we must give equal opportunity to the democratic institutions in our country. And that is what I subscribe to. And so, Mr. Speaker, as we move to this resolution, which seeks the support of the Parliament, Mr. Speaker, I think it is absolutely important to understand not necessarily where we came from, because I believe that may be the natural question. How did we get here? What does the landscape say about how did we get here? And I can hear all of the comments as were presented as to the reasons why we got here. But there'll be a time, there'll be an occasion when we can speak to the road to this destination or this transition where we are, because we are in a transition. There'll be a time to debate it. There'll be a time to debate all of what was put together and all the happenings which may have taken place to bring us where we are at. But, Mr. Speaker, where we are at now is in a situation where there is a pandemic not only in St. Lucia, throughout the region of the Caribbean, throughout the hemisphere, Western, throughout the world, there is a pandemic which calls upon governments, on the advice and guidance of the World Health Organization, on the need for countries to take the necessary measures and understand to date the protocols which we must put in place. So, Mr. Speaker, any government at this time would have found itself in a situation to be able to re-engineer, restructure, remodel, redesign the existing environment, financial environment, to allow us to be able to manage the situation. Consider September 2019. No COVID, economy seemed to be doing good, promise of investment high, the energy levels of the people high, there seemed to be hope, and all seemed to be well moving forward. And suddenly December comes, and the revelation in January that there is a world pandemic would seem to be wreaking havoc in China, in Italy, in the United States, throughout the Western Hemisphere, throughout the world, Mr. Speaker. And governments are called upon to take measures. For us here, Mr. Speaker, we were called upon to take proactive action, and within the shortest possible time, to secure our borders, embrace the protocols proclaimed by the World Health Organization, and to begin the process of securing, protecting, and ensuring that our people were safe. We have done a good job so far, Mr. Speaker, but we recognize that our situation needed much more support than we imagined. Because immediately upon the knowledge and recognition of COVID-19, we recognize that the backbone of our economy, the tourism sector, seemed to be crumbling under threat, and one by one hotels collapsed, creating a situation where the government's cash flow was compromised. And so there was need for action. Immediately upon this, Mr. Speaker, the government felt that there was a need to begin dialogue with the social partners, the economic partners, etc., and the division of labor to meet with those very partners, and in my case, with a team of 3, Minister for Equity, Minister for Commerce, and Minister for Infrastructure, to meet with the public sector unions, to commence the process of dialogue and to encourage them to appreciate where the country is and how we can work together moving forward, recognizing there's threat on the horizon and our ability or our capacity to meet public servant salaries seem to be on the threat. Mr. Speaker, I must take this opportunity here this evening to commend the leadership of the unions in the manner in which they conducted themselves, in their positions taken, their understanding of the current crisis and the challenges of the government, but also I respect them for the positions that they have adopted. And I believe it's only right that for unions to adopt their positions based on the mandates which they have been given. The government itself has said, and we've been very transparent throughout those meetings, in showing and presenting to those unions where we are, what is the situation, and discussing for almost 5 weeks, a total of 7 meetings, making presentations, looking at different scenarios, suggesting and making recommendations, inviting recommendations from them, and saying to them, the government is looking to see how we can work together, not for a salary decrease, not a cut in salaries, but to look at some new modalities, look at some new theories as to how we can commit ourselves or maintain our commitment to the agreements of the unions, but getting some level of consensus and understanding as to whether we can fulfill our commitment by the consideration of a new modality of what we refer to as a blended offer of salaries. This has not happened, Mr. Speaker. But one of the things we consistently said throughout those meetings was a commitment that once the revenues of the state improved and once we are able to raise the necessary resources, Mr. Speaker, government will meet its obligations of paying public officers their salaries. I will not go, Mr. Speaker, I will not go into the details of what we offered in terms of modalities, whether it is a ring fencing of the 1 to 6 workers, or a 50 to 50 cash, 50 bond on the part of workers, and a 25% cash and 75% bond for parliamentarians, ministers of government, etc. I will not go into those details. But, Mr. Speaker, I think we have come a long way from the moment we started, realizing that revenues seem to be projecting to a decrease from 110 million, or between 90 and 110 million a month, down to about 50 million a month. We have come a long way, not only to struggle home and to cross the finish line, making the necessary sacrifices to meet public officers' salaries, and on every occasion when we did it, I felt happy. Because I believe, Mr. Speaker, that in this country, we do have some hard-working public officers who commit themselves to this country. And sometimes we attempt to say the front line. And once we start, Mr. Speaker, to identify the front line, and we speak of nurses and doctors and policemen and other public officers, correctional officers, everyone, the firemen, as you begin to count, Mr. Speaker, we realize that not only should we count frontline officers, but we realize the public service is a public service of essential workers in this country who we have a commitment and a responsibility to. So it means at all times we cannot stop thinking of the challenges. And we understand those challenges, Mr. Speaker. We understand the very significant role of public officers in national development. We understand that very significant contribution, for example, that teachers make to teach our children and the challenges which they face on a daily basis, even if it means to assist in the supply of materials to some of the children and food and other stuff. They all make a contribution. And notwithstanding, Mr. Speaker, that we recognize if we are to survive, we need to take some drastic measures, make some sacrifices. We all are in it together. That notwithstanding the love and the appreciation and the admiration of the service provided by public officers, Mr. Speaker, we know that there are some tough decisions which must be taken. And so, Mr. Speaker, on many occasions, too numerous to mention, whether it's in a virtual environment, day after day after day, this government met at cabinet level discussing how we can proceed, how can we respond within this environment to our commitment. And in some instances, Mr. Speaker, even though the Constitution said that your first charge is that of loans, your loans to fulfill your obligations, which is so important. Because if there's any default at any time, the future looks bleak as far as your ratings and how the international community sees the country. Even then, we considered that our first priority had to be the payment of salaries to teachers. And one of the, I said teachers, but I meant public officers. And one of the things that the Prime Minister often said at all of those meetings is that we are continuing to negotiate. We are continuing to reach out to international agencies. We are continuing to reach out to governments. On many occasions, he left meetings to just go in and have a virtual meeting, whether it's the World Bank, whether it's the government, or whether it's the IMF. What has happened, Mr. Speaker, in those last 7 or 8 weeks thereabout, is that though the dark clouds, now there's a silver lining in that most of those international agencies, the international financial institutions, IFIs, are coming forward and saying, your requests have been approved, and so it eases the pressure to be able to take care of our financial commitments. So the application by the government seeking a loan of 21.4 SDRs, which was approved, Mr. Speaker, it's important that while we understand that it is not unique to St. Lucia, while we understand that any posturing of saying that, hey, we fought for it, we negotiated hard, and we won the battle, while we are not saying that's the reason for achieving it, but there are conditions under which any government can qualify for those monies. So, Mr. Speaker, it is like going to a bank. Going to a bank to look for a loan. You cannot get a loan if you don't have an income. You cannot get a loan if you don't have a reputation. You cannot get a loan if you don't have a good credit record. You cannot get a loan if you don't have a standing. Beg your pardon? Ask Antigua, they can tell us, because they have had their own experiences. So even when they speak with great bravado, what matters most is to be able to stand to those institutions and say, this is who I am, this is where I stand, this is my value. And so, Mr. Speaker, it is important to understand the conditions under which this government obtained the loan. The loan, as it is said, Mr. Speaker, was derived from the Rapid Credit Facility, a special facility to assist governments, particularly poor income countries, to obtain the loans. So the nature or the purpose of the RCF is to provide low access, rapid and concessional financial assistance to countries facing an urgent balance of payment need without export conditionality. In other words, exports post conditionalities. In other words, what it means, Mr. Speaker, for such countries as ours, that is a low access, rapid and concessional financial facility. What made us eligible, Mr. Speaker? We became eligible because of the fact that we face urgent balance of payment needs based on COVID, okay, and the issue of the threat to our economy, okay? And it says that where a full-fledged economic program is either not necessary or not feasible in the country. That's the eligibility. And it speaks of the duration. Financial assistance under the RCF is provided as an outright loan disbursement. While RCF financing takes the form of a one-off disbursement, there is scope for repeat use. A repeat use of the RCF is possible within any 3-year period if the balance of payment need is caused primarily by a sudden and exogenous shock of a country okay, the country has established a track record of adequate microeconomic policies. And I just want to repeat this, Mr. Speaker. It's about reputation. It says there, a repeat use of the RCF. And if you listened earlier, Mr. Speaker, when the member for Castries South spoke, he said that this is not the first time. During the administration, my administration, we accessed that facility. But it's based on reputation. It says a repeat use of the RCF is possible within any 3-year period if the balance of payments need is caused primarily, and it's not about mismanagement. If it is caused by a sudden or exogenous shock, or the country has established a track record of adequate economic policies. So it meant, Mr. Speaker, that we qualified. Okay? What happened was that we were affected by a sudden and exogenous shock. And in this case, it's COVID, a pandemic, which has affected our country, created unemployment, hotels are shutting down, businesses are shutting down, the country's fiscal situation deteriorating, and the need to find resources to manage our affairs in this country. To access it, Mr. Speaker, it is determined on a case-by-case basis. It is not a carte blanche thing, but a case-by-case basis. And there are at least 5 requirements. You have to take into consideration the country's balance of payment need, the strength of the macroeconomic policies, capacity to repay the fund, the amount of outstanding fund credit, and the member's record of past use of the fund credit. These are the requirements to access the fund. So, Mr. Speaker, we qualified on those conditions. And so the intention is to use those funds based on the conditions, the terms and conditions established by the IMF. Anything stated here, Mr. Speaker, for use of the IMF funds were approved by the IMF. The terms and conditions set. It is not a situation where you apply to the IMF gives you an envelope of money and say, go ahead and do what you want. But rather, you need to meet the conditions and to ensure that you fulfill all of the objectives set in those terms and conditions. What's that? I can make a request to the IMF letter, Mr. Speaker, but to say that the activities which the IMF indicated or which the IMF approved, and I think the minister mentioned it early on, and I'll just respond to a few. The question of the agriculture transformation, and that, of course, Mr. Speaker, is one spearheaded by the Ministry of Agriculture. And I'm sure that the Minister for Agriculture, having heard some of the ideas coming forward, the leader of the opposition stood up, Mr. Speaker, and I have no hesitation in saying that he presented some proposals which I think are proposals that we all can work with and to be able to get this country going. So part of the proposals in agriculture, certainly, Mr. Speaker, can be considered. The question of agricultural transformation, banana recovery, the question of road improvement, and I'll come to road improvement later, Mr. Speaker, the maintenance of public buildings. Ever so often, Mr. Speaker, we are told that buildings, there are sick buildings within the government establishment, within the assets of government. And very often, Mr. Speaker, offices have got to vacate buildings because of mold and other issues, the need to get those buildings going. And while the amount of 1 million, Mr. Speaker, may seem small, I believe it's a serious issue which needs even further assistance. The rehabilitation of schools, Mr. Speaker, $5 million. Another issue that we constantly come to this Parliament and debate and to see what ways we can improve of that situation. Computerization of schools, $3.8 million. New National Hospital in 2 locations, $16 million and $3.7 million, Mr. Speaker. The question of the COVID support to the sectors. And then you've got a further program, income support program of $24 million, which is a program designed to assist persons who are not in the formal contribution of the NIC, but to give them some support from the government of St. Lucia. But, Mr. Speaker, in some of the contributions made by members, and this seemed to be a common call, whether it is in discussions with the unions or anybody, who would say, open the lockbox and use the money from the lockbox, suspend construction projects and pay public officers and do what we have to do, and a number of things. The problem, Mr. Speaker, about disturbing some of those programs is that if you use some of those funds to maintain or rather to pay public officers alone, some of those initiatives are not sustainable. But you see, Mr. Speaker, in construction, while we are here saying that we should use the monies just to pay off, the ILO, Mr. Speaker, in response to COVID is saying, no. The ILO is saying, use this as an opportunity. Because COVID, Mr. Speaker, while it is a pandemic, it is also an opportunity. It is an opportunity for our various sectors to revisit their modus operandi. It's an opportunity for them to see the low-hanging fruits. It's an opportunity to see how they can re-engineer. It's an opportunity to do things better, to do things a different way, to bring about greater results. And so, Mr. Speaker, the IMF is saying governments should engage in public employment programs, PEPs, to see how we can augment the situation to help our workers. And it says, in many parts of the world, the health crisis has already transformed into an economic and labor market shock, impacting not only supply, but also demand. It goes on further, Mr. Speaker, to say all businesses, regardless of size, are facing serious challenges, especially those in the tourism and hospitality services sector, with a real threat of significant declines in revenue, insolvencies, and job losses in specific areas. But what is most important, Mr. Speaker, is that the ILO is saying that the ILO proposes or promotes public employment programs, also termed public works programs, PEPs, and PEPs are adaptive policy instruments that can create employment, complement social protection provisions, and are often part of active labor market policies. So what the ILO is saying, Mr. Speaker, is that while there's this threat, and while people are panicking, while people are developing their own anxieties, the ILO is saying to governments, stop. Look within. Look within your programs for infrastructure development and see how you can reshape and remodel and repurpose those programs, particularly as it pertains to employment creation. And that is what the government means, Mr. Speaker, when we keep saying that investment programs in infrastructure is one area that we can emphasize on to create employment to our people. Because it means that if you have an infrastructure program, you can redesign the program to create more labor component rather than mechanical component. And in the Ministry of Infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, Infrastructure, Ports, Energy and Labor, we are now in negotiations with the ILO, who has indicated a commitment to St. Lucia to run a pilot project that will look at how the government can engage in this proposed public employment program. Now, for us in St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, this is nothing new. The government of the United Workers' Party has, for years, particularly since 2006, 2007, the one I led, particularly that government, and moving on, this government has always been involved in public employment programs. In fact, one of the achievements of the United Workers' Party through that kind of public employment is the creation of small contractors, and I use the term too numerous to mention. So now, in almost every community, you have a cadre of what we call contractors. I started it. In fact, I mean, sometimes I say, you know, it is the best. I'm saying it was the best and the worst initiative that we undertook, because now we have, to my mind, an oversupply of contractors throughout the country. So unlike before, Mr. Speaker, whereas a road to be built, the moment you speak of a road to be built, Mr. Speaker, you'd consider a big contractor, one of the big names, the mega construction companies. Today, I don't know about this start, but I know where we started. Today, Mr. Speaker, we know in each and every constituency, whether it's in East Castries or South Castries or Choiseul or Dennery, we know we can identify people who were given an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, through public employment to be able to build roads and drains, and who have done a fantastic job in that effort. And this happened on during both administrations. But this is the benefit of public employment. And the ILO is saying this. The ILO is saying the 4 key developmental outcomes of public employment are employment creation, which I've spoken about, the question of social protection, because the ILO is saying, Mr. Speaker, if you're able to create public employment, those who are gaining entry into the public employment program can provide the support to their families, extended families and friends, and to suppress whatever is happening, the anxieties that is happening in our society. It is said, Mr. Speaker, the socio-economic outcomes. They're saying physical and natural assets, roads, water and sanitation, water and soil conservation, services, early childhood development, care support in communities, etc., and the list goes on. Mr. Speaker, what the public employment program being proposed by the ILO is doing is saying to us, let us use this pandemic as an opportunity to continue to implement the infrastructure programs of the government and other programs within the public service, using persons who have lost their jobs and persons who are perpetually unemployed but who've got skills, and even those who are not skilled, to use them in appropriate areas to make a contribution and to sustain themselves during this period of time. And so, Mr. Speaker, in this loan which we are applying, when you look at the various areas which we have mentioned, in every area, whether it's in the new hospital, whether it's to mount equipment, or to do remodeling at the, what's it called, the respiratory center, in all of those areas, Mr. Speaker, the government's public employment program is one which generates employment and introduces into the economy an amount of $29 million, which now stimulates the base of the economy and to keep things happening in the country. Mr. Speaker, I would hope that this would give some comfort to those who are concerned. I hope it gives comfort to those who are concerned. Because we could have said as a government, let us find all the money we can find and maintain the public service. And I understand, Mr. Speaker, that the public service cannot be equated, you cannot equate the public service to the private sector. So as ILO is saying, Mr. Speaker, businesses, large and small, will collapse. But one thing that cannot collapse, Mr. Speaker, is the public service. Because the public service, Mr. Speaker, must survive to provide the services to the people, and the country must find the resources to maintain the public service so as to ensure that we maintain the country and move in the direction that we ought to move, with a sound public sector investment program and with programs that we can be proud of as far as the development of the country is concerned. Now, Mr. Speaker, moving forward, the question is, beyond this resolution, what must the country do? How are we going to face the challenges forward? And I'm hearing all of the concerns about opening up the border, extending emergency powers and curfews, etc., and opening up to the United States, which probably has the worst record of the management of COVID. But I believe in every way, in addressing those situations, we have said all the necessary protocols will be developed and introduced to ensure the protection of our people, so that notwithstanding probably the eagerness to get the economy back on its feet, we are also very conscious that we must do it in a manner that doesn't compromise the health and well-being of our St. Lucian people. Now, in a number of instances, Mr. Speaker, as we discuss COVID and we discuss other issues, it is important for each and every government department to understand those opportunities that present itself. So I often say, if you take the Ministry of Health, COVID is really and truly about public health. It's about sanitation. It's about hygiene. It's about the environment. It's about how our practices. And so what must be done, Mr. Speaker, and what is being done by the Ministry of Health, is to introduce and to strengthen and underpin those programs of what I call culture in terms of our behavior as citizens very conscious of our health, to ensure that all of those areas are taken into consideration. Other departments must look and see how can we strengthen some of the practices that we should have had as a culture, a behavior. And these are some of the opportunities, Mr. Speaker, which COVID is presenting to us to begin to get on and to do certain things to ensure that by the time we get out of COVID, not only do we speak of a new norm, but there's a new culture, a new behavior, a new adherence to laws and enforcement, etc., etc. I want to also, Mr. Speaker, in supporting this resolution, to state that many a times in the various debates that we've had, there seemed to be the question not only of the lockbox, but there's the question of the gas tax. How much is in the lockbox of the gas tax? How much have we collected? What are we doing with it? Etc., etc. Mr. Speaker, the gas tax, ever since it was introduced, the projected yield is $30 million a year. And one of the commitments and promises that we made was that the revenue from the gas tax or the gas levy is to apply to the repairs and construction of roads throughout the country. And while my dear friend is asking where's the $30 million, I would like you to drive through the country. Drive through the country, go to Soufrière and see the roads that were built. Go to Miku and see the roads that have been built. Go to Laritret and see the road that is being undertaken at this time. Go to Saltibus and see what is being done in Saltibus. Go throughout the country, Mr. Speaker, and see what is being done with the levy. That is where it is located. And notwithstanding, Mr. Speaker, and it reminds me when I worked in the bank, this gentleman who came, Mr. Speaker, every Friday and said, so we had to give him a withdrawal slip. He filled it up and we paid him his money, leaving $1 in the account so that the account doesn't shut down. And after he checks it, he said, Mr. Speaker, the evidence is there. It is in almost every community. I'm sure my dear friend can attest to the fact, that when you look at the condition of roads, and I hate boasting of my performance, look at the condition of roads, whether it is to do with potholing, Mr. Speaker. I remember when I came in, Mr. Speaker, we have a date to go and visit those areas and to, get those things going. But, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the roads, whether it is about the potholing, Mr. Speaker, the improvement. I recall when I came in, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not blaming my predecessor because I know he tried, Mr. Speaker. But there was a map of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, which was produced. And the map showed that there were potholes all over St. Lucia, including potholes on the Piton, potholes in the Sulphur Spring, pothole throughout the country, pothole in every place, even where those areas were farms. I'm sure you remember that, my dear friend from Denry North. But that was then, Mr. Speaker, potholes all over the country. But today, Mr. Speaker, all over, Tupa ici, Tupa là, Tupa tout. But, Mr. Speaker, today, with an effective program, utilizing the resources of the levy, and I don't like to leave my friend in the dark. We share borders. We share borders. Our borders are not shut. We are open. We share even facilities, and we have a good relationship. I will show him where that money goes and how it is spent. But through the yield from the gas tax, Mr. Speaker, we have been able to demonstrate a very ambitious and effective road improvement program throughout the country. But Mr. Speaker, more than this, Mr. Speaker, is that we have said that the money which we have borrowed from the Taiwanese, of some $42 million. Mr. Speaker, don't worry about them. I'll take care of them. Mr. Speaker, the money which we have borrowed from the Taiwanese, the $42 million US, there is an arrangement that though there is a moratorium on the repayment of that loan of 5 years, that the funds or the resources from the 30 million, Mr. Speaker, will go into what we call the lockbox for payment of the loan when it triggers off. But during that period of time, we've got to pay interest, etc. So as we speak, Mr. Speaker, a number of the projects going on are done through the Taiwanese loan program as a consequence of the lockbox, as a consequence of the gas tax, okay? As a consequence of the tax. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, during this period, what we are doing is to allocate a percentage towards the payment of the loan when the time comes, and to utilize some of this to continue our program of roadworks throughout the country, going into constituency by constituency, community by community, to ensure that those programs, those projects are completed. And let me say this, Mr. Speaker. I want to assure members that the intention of this program is not in any way, as far as I am concerned, designed for election. It is a promise which was made. Negotiations started in 2017, 2018. It was a very long process dealing with the Taiwanese Exim Bank. It took some time. Eventually, we got over it, knowing the difficulty and the long, winded process of negotiating with the Asians. But we got through there, Mr. Speaker, and the intention is to go through the country, constituency by constituency, community by community, regardless of political support or affiliation, to serve the people of this country. And so, my friend, when you become Speaker, I shall sit when time is up. So, Mr. Speaker, as I've said earlier on, the intention of this resolution is to assist us in our endeavor to take care of the people. And many times I've heard aspersions cast about those on this side don't care about the people, etc., etc. I believe every politician cares about the people. Everyone. Everyone. And even when we say it, we know that's not true. Even when we say it, we know that's not true. Because many of us, Mr. Speaker, and I know in recent weeks, there are those who have attempted to make statements about ministers and not parliamentarians about salaries. Make statements of ministers and not parliamentarians about our salaries, and that we're just about increasing our salaries. We all know that parliamentarians were awarded a salary increase, which was finally introduced or applied last year. We all know the process. We all know that from in 2008 thereabout, there was a Salaries Review Commission. And if there's one thing, Mr. Speaker, I must commend the leader of the opposition and the opposition, was for the introduction of legislation to deal with salaries of top public officers and parliamentarians, in that we don't institute our salaries. We do not legislate our salaries. We legislate it only on the recommendation of an appointed Public Service Commission, Salaries Review Commission, who would review salaries ever so often. And the Salaries Review Commission made a recommendation. And for as long as the two of us serve, we would get the same increase. All of us would get the same level of increase, based on whether you're in opposition or you're in government. But we all know, Mr. Speaker, as parliamentarians, on a daily basis, we are called upon by the people to reach out to them, whether it is to assist them in their daily lives, social assistance that they can't get from the normal social programs. Every time, every week, every weekend, all of us are called upon, every day, all of us are called upon to assist people, one way or the other. And so even when one may say, well, I've only got one son or 2 children or 3 children, but we all around this table, Mr. Speaker, have adopted thousands and thousands of children, and we must not be afraid to say that we serve them all and we are paid for the service that we offer. Many years, Mr. Speaker, politicians, and we seem to be ashamed sometimes to talk about it, for many years there were ministers who served in ministries earning less money than permanent secretaries and deputy permanent secretaries and others. So this is very disingenuous for those who seem to use this opportunity, when what we are saying, let us all participate, let us all make the sacrifice to refer to a recommendation which was legally made, just like every other recommendation was made, for parliamentarians to be considered and to be given a salary increase. Mr. Speaker, I do hope that this resolution which has been presented is one that will help us navigate the turbulent waters at this time. If there's one thing it tells us, that while we may believe, and while some may believe rather, that when we find ourselves in such situations, that we can simply switch a button and call the bank and ask the bank to assist us, or to call a government and say we need money. On this occasion, Mr. Speaker, what it said to us, not only that we are all in this together, but while we are all in it together, we are looking around us, and we know that we may be drowning, but we are looking at those who we normally look up to, and we find them below us, drowning more than we think we are. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the approval of this resolution so as to grant us the opportunity to continue to provide the necessary services to our people, to the children of this country, to the mothers and fathers of this country, to the public servants who we care for, and to all those who depend on us, knowing that as a caring government, we will do all that is possible to provide for them, to give them the opportunity, to help them develop their confidence in the country and the government, and to help them understand that it will not always be good and smooth sailing at all times. It will not always be that. But there are times when we all will have to face some challenges. But for us, we too will face the challenge, but reach out at every moment to help them in this very difficult period in the history of our country. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Vieux-Fort North.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, it is very interesting, Mr. Speaker, when you listen to the member for Castries North, he often, Mr. Speaker, tries to separate himself from a government that has demonstrated over the last 4 years that they really don't have the best interests of the people of St. Lucia at heart. This motion, Mr. Speaker, speaks to the loan which the government seeks from the International Monetary Fund to assist with the COVID-19 situation. And the member for Castries North starts by saying, Mr. Speaker, that when he considers the state of emergency debate earlier today, he sometimes thinks instead of 4 months, it can be 2 months. So you can see what is happening. Softens the blow. He goes on to say, Mr. Speaker, that he would not be part of a government that is bent, as some members opposite, he says, tries to make people believe that the government is trying to suppress the freedom of people. And if that's the case, he will not be part of that government. He went on to say, Mr. Speaker, that he's not going to be part of a government that is not going to protect the rights of people and do the best for St. Lucians. It's his choice, Mr. Speaker, to say what he feels in his heart. But the actions of his government go directly against what he's saying. I didn't hear him talk about discrimination against parliamentarians on this side where the constituency development program is concerned. He didn't say he would not be part of a government that discriminates against parliamentarians on this side of the House. I didn't hear him say that suddenly the laptop program is very important and that children now can eat laptops. I didn't hear him say those things. So, Mr. Speaker, the member for Castries North is famous for doing that. It's not him, it's not me, it's them. I'm not in it. Mr. Speaker, this 29 million US dollars equates to about 77 million EC dollars. And what we are saying on this side of the House is that all of the recommendations of the International Monetary Fund seem to suggest, Mr. Speaker, that we should be concerned mainly about income support and welfare support. I'm not going to be very long, Mr. Speaker, but I will quote from the IMF itself to indicate the three priorities that the IMF believes should be the focus of governments with this kind of support. What we are saying on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, is that the government has not demonstrated that it is going to change course because of COVID-19, that it's going to do things very differently, and the member for Castries South has said it. He said basically that this is part of the seeking funds to fund the budget, and that they are not going to deviate from what's in the budget, and the intention is to fund their budget. Doesn't matter whether you have COVID-19 or not COVID-19, or no COVID-19. And if, Mr. Speaker, there are funds from the IMF, they will go straight back to funding the budget. So there is no change by this government. Whatever the government presented in the estimates debate is what they are doing now. There's no change, there's no creativity. The funding of bridges, concrete and steel, who gets direct awards. All of these things have happened, and the member for Castries North says, oh, I'm not going to be part of a government who doesn't do this for the people and that for the people. The evidence does not support what he's saying there, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this disaster demonstrates that governments need to come together in dialogue with the people. And what we continue to say is this. If this government just a while ago reneged on an agreement with the National Trust, which involved the Attorney General, how can we trust this government now with $77 million from the IMF to say that they are going to help the people of St. Lucia? They have said so before. They came here in 3-4 different budget presentations and gave glorious presentations, made glorious presentations about helping the people of St. Lucia. And we saw what happened with healthcare. We saw what happened with so many of the projects. We are not convinced, Mr. Speaker. They have come here to say that they are going to help hundreds of St. Lucians. What happened to the Carbot? 30 million. Another $32 million in loans for sporting facilities. What happened to CHTTI? Where was the member for Castries North when the CHTTI, all of the issues around CHTTI, the Pomandu, $13 million. What happened to that? And where was the member for Castries North then? $24 million to a hotel in tax relief. Maybe the member for Castries North believes that was a good thing, so he could be part of that kind of government. And so, Mr. Speaker, these words of polish and flair don't measure up to the reality that this government cannot be trusted to deliver to the people of St. Lucia to deal with welfare priorities. I listened to the member for Babuno earlier on, and he spoke about what will be done for agriculture. And he said part of this money from the IMF will be used to help farmers produce. But he's the same member who came not too long ago to say that they have overproduced. That we have a problem. The problem that we have in St. Lucia is that we have too much food. But now he's going to use money to give farmers to produce more food. Contradiction. I don't believe we have too much food, but there's a kind of contradiction. And money to give farmers for seeds and so on. But yet, he said a while ago, earlier today, that the hotels are closed and the farmers basically don't know where to sell their food. So when you hear that kind of contradiction, when you hear these contradictions from members opposite, you know very well that the money from the IMF will not be used for what the IMF thinks it should be used for. Let me quickly, Mr. Speaker, I know the hour is late. The IMF produced many reports about the emergency funding to assist with the COVID-19. And if you go to the IMF site, International Monetary Fund, questions and answers, which the last update which I'm reading from is from May 20th, 2020. And the IMF discusses what countries can do and what countries should do. And the IMF indicates there are three priorities. The first priority is to protect lives. And this includes health expenditures. It should be at the top priority. Top priority, funding health systems, medical equipment, and so on. The second priority is to protect livelihoods. And listen to some of the ideas, some of the recommendations. Ensuring that lifelines for households and businesses are available during the period of the economic standstill. Cash transfers, wage subsidies, tax relief, help in unemployment insurance if possible, extending, increasing benefits, relaxing the eligibility criteria. Well-paid sick and family leave is not among the standard benefits. Governments should consider funding it to allow unwell workers or caregivers to stay home without the fear of losing their jobs during the epidemic. This is what the IMF is saying. That is what the focus should be on. And while we've heard the government speak about helping people, we are not hearing that kind of focus here. On monetary policy, the government is the IMF is talking about lending to small and medium-sized enterprises, lending, which may be less prepared to withstand a sharp disruption at this critical stage. I didn't hear the government speak about that. Lending to small businesses, all of those individuals with the small shops, and so on. The government's fixation is on the concrete projects which they had planned for before COVID, and instead of sitting back and reorganizing the plans for the economy in this COVID crisis, they have simply funded what they've always said they would do. There's no big creativity in that. And finally, the IMF said, priority number 3 is to prepare for recovery. So you can see clearly the focus is to ensure that the small businesses in particular, and when we speak of small businesses, we're talking about support so that those businesses can continue to operate, people can continue to be employed. We're talking about the bus drivers. We're talking about small farmers and fishers. And they're talking about, okay, you give support to the fishers by possibly giving them cash or giving them money. The IMF is talking about continued sustenance until the crisis is over. And so, preparing for recovery, according to the IMF, is now to talk about how do you prevent companies from going bankrupt? How do you cause companies to preserve their trade networks? And if you do that, the IMF is saying, you can recover sooner. But this is not what we're hearing. This is not what we're hearing. This is not what we're hearing. The relocation, what we're hearing is the relocation of the Boseju agricultural station with the money of the IMF. So, Famani pour savoir, l'argent ça la gouvernement joue par IMF, c'est ça qu'il fait puis. Relocation of the, it's on page 62 of the estimates. How you mean it's not true? It's on page 62 of, 612 of the estimates. Relocation of the Boseju agricultural station. Okay? The agricultural transformation program. which is a program of the Banana Accompanying Measures, the BAM. So now the IMF money has been married to the BAM. So there's no creativity there, Mr. Speaker. La bani pièce bagay neuf parce que COVID vini yo ka changer. I see on page 613 of the estimates the Vieux-Fort water supply project from the IMF money. But I thought there was CDB money for that. On page 617 of the estimates, the Cul-de-Sac Bridge. I see the Opico Bellevue Road, so I'm wondering, it's a pity the member for Castries North has spoken. Is this a payment? Or has he decided to continue the project? Because it's there from the IMF money. Road improvement and maintenance, and the member for Castries North spoke about the maintenance of public buildings. He spoke about major rehabilitation of schools. The new National Hospital Commissioning. The Housing and Population Census on page 640 of the estimates. Now, Mr. Speaker, how does the Housing and Population Census end up in the IMF loan? On page, I don't know. I mean, I'm seeking explanation. And while the hour is late, the member for Castries, I didn't want to speak, but when I heard a member for Castries now saying, oh, we're doing very well, and this is good for everybody, and there's no problems, and so on, I have to ask myself, what kind of, in the karate movies, there was somebody for a long beard, they called him Skinny Guy, and some other name. That's the kind of role. What kind of thing is that? How does the Housing and Population Census come into the new IMF loan? The monies from the new IMF loan. So it's very clear that the government has simply taken the IMF loan and just funding its program. And while some of these are income generating, they are creating employment. There's no doubt about that. There's no doubt about that. But, Mr. Speaker, does it match what the IMF is suggesting? How is the government going to ensure that all of these small businesses, the people who suffered, will maintain their staff, which is what they're suggesting. Which is what they're suggesting. So what I want to say here, Mr. Speaker, is very, very simple. That this government has not demonstrated that we can trust them to use the money from the IMF to benefit the people as they should. We surely believe that the people need the money and they need support. But the projects that are down to be accomplished with this IMF money is simply the government's projects. It's simply projects that were already down in the estimates, and no creativity there. No creativity there at all. So yes, the people need the money, but we do not believe that the government should use the money for some of those projects that they have there. They should change some of these projects to cause the people to benefit. And wait for it, Mr. Speaker. The direct awards and most of the benefits, once again, for the FFFs. Wait for it, Mr. Speaker. So I hope the people benefit. I truly hope these people who have lost their jobs, the small businesses who have staff waiting to continue to be employed, I really hope these people benefit. But based on this government's record, I don't believe they will. We are hoping they would. I don't believe they will. And I look forward to the day when the member for Castries North will really act when he says he's not going to be part of a government that does this and that and this and that. I wonder what this government has to do. I mean, if he does not say, that's okay. He could just be part of the government and not say these things in Parliament, Mr. Speaker. Be part of his government, enjoy himself, do his work as he says. Building roads, he said, all over the place. Governments continue to build roads all over the place and put potholes in roads all over the place. build 21 bridges all over the place. He can continue to do that. But when it comes to the parliament to say he's not going to be part of a government who behaves like this and who behaves like that, as if he's very different to them. That is not so, Mr. Speaker. All of these decisions, they sit in cabinet and take those decisions. The state of emergency, all of those things. And so, he's part of the government. They are oppressing the people of St. Lucia. He's part of a government. They have decided to go for a state of emergency until the end of September. He's part of a government that continues to break agreements with National Trust or with the Attorney General. That's the government that he's part of. That is the government that he's part of. And whether his heart is not in there, it's a different heart, I don't know, I can't read his heart. As the member for Castries is always say. But right now he's part of this kind of government. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's been a long night, and we still have one more bill to go before the evening is ended. Mr. Speaker, there were many points that were brought up by members on the opposite side, but there seems to be a recurrent theme, Mr. Speaker, and maybe if I can just take a very quick minute to really talk about where this IMF loan fits into the overall scheme of what we're attempting to do. And I'm not going to try to oversimplify, Mr. Speaker, the budget of St. Lucia. But the budget of St. Lucia is really broken out into three principal parts, Mr. Speaker. The first part is our debt financing, which is approximately $310 million. The second part of the budget is our wages and salaries, which includes pensions, is $560 million. And the last part is the operations of government, the operating budget, which is $400 million, Mr. Speaker. And when you get into the operating budget, you start breaking it out. Rent is $55 million. Utilities is another $24 million. Operating of offices, so transportation, all those kinds of things eventually add up. And there are some basic programs in there. There are the transfers of monies to our social programs, things like your school feeding program, things like your bus subsidy for kids, your NICE program, your stimulus program. These are the kinds of things that make up the $400 million. In fact, when you go through, Mr. Speaker, it adds up very fast, even though the number of $400 million seems like a lot of money. So government found itself now in a position, Mr. Speaker, that when it looked at its operating budget, there was an increase in the operating budget this year. That increase came from $33 million, Mr. Speaker, to cover the additional cost of COVID. It came from an additional cost of, Mr. Speaker, of the increase in the salaries that we've paid our civil servants. I'm very proud of the fact, Mr. Speaker, that our government was the first government that I know of that actually negotiated an agreement with the unions in advance of its period. Generally, Mr. Speaker, what happens is that our collective agreements are agreed on after the collective agreement period has expired, and we intend to be, we most often are paying reimbursements for our workers. We actually negotiated it in advance, and so that is included in the increase. And the other big increase, Mr. Speaker, in our budget this year was in health. We have expanded the operating facilities at our polyclinics. and also by moving from Victoria Hospital, that was traditionally a cost of $35 million, Mr. Speaker. We've now moved into OKEU, and the estimated cost is $70 million. That's if we ran it for the year. But we had not budgeted the full $70 million because we were not intending to move into OKEU until September. And also the intention, Mr. Speaker, was for us to have had the new health insurance program up and running in June or July, which would have facilitated in offsetting some of that $70 million. But the fact is, because of COVID, we've had to advance that. In addition to that, to operationalize OKEU, we had to spend another $28 million. So that's 28 plus 30, that's 58, plus another 33 for COVID. And that's included in the $400 million, Mr. Speaker. Then we looked at our revenues. As we indicated, and the evidence is there, Mr. Speaker, every single year the revenues of this country have gone up, not marginally, have gone up significantly. The member from Castries East makes reference that this year's budget was less than last year's. That's covered in the Social Economic Review. We've discussed that. In the Social Economic Review, they said that there was a reduction, a slight reduction in revenues because there was an impact on the tourism industry in the last quarter of this year. So January, February, and March, tourism arrivals collectively were down 20%, but in the month of March alone, it was down 60%. Clearly, that's going to impact your revenues. And despite that, it's the second highest revenue number that we've had ever. And I want to remind members on the opposite side that these revenue increases came even though the VAT rate was reduced. So in fact, the government's policies were working because the VAT stayed the same. But the other part of the revenue was personal income tax as well as corporate income tax because activity grew in the country. That's where it came from. And I know that there was a backhanded compliment somewhere by members on the opposite side, Mr. Speaker, because there's no way that the government would have been able to go out and borrow $900 million if there was not confidence in the economy. That is the reality. And I think the member from Babonneau put it extremely well, that all of this was done with construction contracting. So it was real growth. And that growth was being felt by thousands of people, represented where? The fact is the unemployment rate in this country dropped from 25% to 16%. The other aspect of this budget, Mr. Speaker, before I get into the details, the other part of this budget which we want to discuss is this continuing suggestion by members of the opposite side that the monies from the IMF or the monies from CDB or the monies from the ECCU are being used to fund programs. The programs that they're being used to fund, Mr. Speaker, are the social programs that underline the benefit and the conscience of this country. That is what we've been doing, is to maintain those programs. So the same way that we want to pay salaries is the same way that we want to continue those programs. And in fact, the amount that we're going to have to spend on those programs has increased. The amount that we're having to spend on the farmers in solving the problem with Windfresh and the banana farmers not being paid. The fact that banana farmers have lost an income with the hotel sector to being able to give them some kind of help. This government, Mr. Speaker, has not even announced its economic stimulus program. In fact, what we have done is created an Economic Recovery Council, of which members on the opposite side were invited to. And you know, and the member from Castries South, made a question, and he said he was hoping it would be answered before the end of the day, whether in fact the Minister of Finance has signed the warrant. Yes, I have. No, not today. There's a process, Mr. Speaker, that if he is interested in getting any information,
Mr. Speaker, on a point
he
of
knows
order.
what the process
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order. If a minister, and we're very clear, we can go and quote the authorities on that, if the minister makes reference to a document within his department before this House and cites it, he has to make a copy available to the House. Can the minister make available to this House? I raise it from morning that the warrant be made available to this House to certify that, yes, the warrant has been signed and this process can continue. It would not be acceptable for the Prime Minister and Minister of Finance to say that to this House and not make a copy available. The rules are very clear as to the operations of Parliament.
Honorable Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Quick question, sir. Quick question. Do you have a copy of the warrant with you right now? Then, yeah. No. Honorable Prime Minister, I will take it that in due course you will make them available. That's fine.
Mr. Speaker, the member of the House is very aware that there is a process if he wants to get information.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order,
Mr.
I did not hear your ruling on the matter because the rules are very clear, Mr. Speaker. I raised it when I spoke this morning and the rules are
Honorable
clear.
Member, I didn't care to the Prime Minister. I asked the Prime Minister whether he had it with him. He said he did not have it with him at this present. And I did. I think it's back here. Honorable Prime Minister, and as I indicated, that I did ask the Prime Minister if he had a copy of the warrant with him. He said no. And then I said to him that he'll make a copy available to the House in due course. Okay?
Mr. Speaker, in a letter that the Leader of the Opposition wrote to the Permanent Secretary of Finance, questioned whether in fact that the government had the ability to spend any monies under the appropriations bill, because the members indicated we had not passed the appropriations bill. So in fact, the entity that made them aware of Section 22 that they made reference to today was in fact the government. In fact, even in a private note to the member from Castries East, I pointed that out to him when he had made the request publicly. And I said to him, look, I didn't bring it up because here is exactly what we did. There is a requirement, Mr. Speaker, for the government to pass the estimates. We have 30 days. And then afterwards, Mr. Speaker, on Section 22, so in your letter of May 4th, you raised the concern that the Prime Minister proceeded to lay the estimates of revenue and expenditure in the House in April 2020. You also questioned how the objectives of the committee would be realized without being contained by the government's actions emanating from the approval of the estimates of revenues and expenditure. The estimates of revenue and expenditure, along with the authorization of the government expenditure, is governed by Part 5 of the Finance Administrative Act and the Constitution of St. Lucia. The Department of Finance is guided by the provisions therein and has always endeavored to be in full compliance with laws of the state and has advised the government accordingly. The estimates of revenue and expenditure for the financial year 2021 was laid before the House of Assembly as per the requirements of Section 19(1) and 2 of the Finance Act, i.e., not later than 30 days after the commencement of the financial year. Further, Section 80 of the Constitution and Section 22 of the Finance Administrative Act provide a mechanism for the introduction of a provisional Gellerin warrant to facilitate government's continued operations. where the appropriation bill referenced in Section 20 of the Financial Administration Act has not come into operations. It should be noted that the broad application of this terminology, services of the government, cover both the recurrent and the capital expenditure. So I say that, Mr. Speaker, in that we provided them the information. How is it that the government who would respond provide with the information very clearly understanding what the process is? And I also indicated to members on the opposite side, Mr. Speaker, that we wanted to wait until we knew exactly or better idea of what the revenue numbers were going to be.
Mr. Speaker, just on the point of order, Mr. Speaker, this letter the Prime Minister is reading is not a letter he wrote to me, you know. So I just want it to be clear that that letter is not a letter written to me by the Prime Minister, just for the record, because the impression may be given that the Prime Minister replied. That letter was not written by the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think that I made that point very clear when I started off. I said this was a letter written to the member from Castries East by the Director of Finance in response to a letter that he wrote to her. So, Mr. Speaker, the point is that we have been and are allowed to spend money on projects that have been previously approved. Can't do any new projects. And we can spend up to 1/3 of the operation cost of those projects outside of the recurrent expenditure. But what's very important, Mr. Speaker, in this entire process? So we already know that we have $310 million in debt financing, $560 million in wages and pensions, and $400 million in operating cost. And the fact is we have a shortfall of revenue. The tax revenue that we were going to collect, which we projected at $925 million, created a shortfall of $560 million, Mr. Speaker. And that $560 million, Mr. Speaker, did not include any monies being allocated if, in fact, the bonds and treasury bills were not rolled over. So that would have been on top of the $560 million. And the reality is the member from Vieux-Fort South, and I said it. I said I congratulated him. He was the only person on the other side that actually understood the budget. Fact is that the $920 million, which comes out to $77 million a month, was ambitious. And we've seen it. We could predict, but the fact is the $920 million was already a reduction from the $1.2 billion that we generated in revenue before. And that was based on an estimate that the economy was going to contract by 10%. But in reality, that we're seeing that the economy is contracting by a faster rate than the 10%. And so the discussions that started with the unions in April of 2nd was already in anticipation of that, because we kept on saying to the unions, we've been able to find the funding for the main part of the budget, but the shortfall in revenue, which we're anticipating now, because we were seeing that the month of April, even at the beginning, that we were seeing a contraction in the revenue, because we'd already seen a contraction in the month of March. The revenue came out in the month of April at $50 million. And remember, we're talking about that we projected $77 million. So that's $27 million short. Plus, the bonds and treasury bills, we saw a 25% redemption rate. And remember, the redemption rate is the percentage of persons that were going to redeem or want back their money. And that was another $15 million. And hence, the $41 million of increased payables, that's where it came from. So I want to say that the monies from the IMF, the 35 million US coming in from CDB, which has not been approved as yet, the 20 million US dollars coming in from the Taiwanese, the $67 million coming in from the central bank, the additional overdraft facilities we approved today, those monies make up the $500 million. So that is to fund the budget. Absolutely correct. What is it funding? It's funding the $310 million, it's funding the salaries and wages, and it's funding the $400 million in operating costs. But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, is that we now need to either raise $325 million more or cut costs. So in fact, when you read the IMF letter, what the IMF letter is saying is we should try to minimize the amount of money that we've borrowed. And this government could not find it in itself to go and ask the civil servants to take a pay cut. But other countries in the world, Saudi Arabia, 20% cut across the board. Other countries are doing the same thing. The Bermuda cabinet has cut their salaries by 12.5% and said we're leading the way. So that suggests that there's cuts coming. But that's the option. But in April, we said to them, look, we believe that we can raise the monies, we can fill the gap, but the difficulty we're going to have, Mr. Speaker, is that the monies are coming in later in the year, and therefore there's going to be a cash shortage. So the deferment of salaries was simply to give us that that amount of cash to move forward. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm certainly not going to suggest anything disingenuous about the member from Castries East when he stood up while the member from Ancillary Canneries was speaking and gave some note as to what the Prime Minister Motley says. But this morning, and I make it a document of the House, Mr. Speaker, 2 articles came out. It says labor unions have until the end of June to discuss government's proposed forced savings plan with their membership. This is after just under 3 hours of talks at the Lloyd Erskine Sanford Center yesterday afternoon. Labour leaders emerged from a meeting with Prime Minister Mia Motley and several senior government officials and headed to their respective headquarters to discuss the proposals for a national meeting turn with their executive councils. At the virtual celebration of the 2-year anniversary of her government on Sunday, Motley outlined this form of forced savings would result in every public servant and person who is paid by government receiving the majority of their pay in cash and the remainder being held in bonds carrying an interest rate of 5%. While not going into many details of yesterday's meeting, President of the National Union of Public Workers, Akani McDowell, told the media some information was shared with the union, and what we'd like to do at this time is to meet with our committee and to share that information with them. After this, we will have a broader discussion with the general membership and then eventually the broader public. He said, adding that the government has given them an end of June deadline to conclude these discussions. Mr. Speaker, we have been meeting with our unions since April 2nd. April 2nd. April 2nd. So, Mr. Speaker, the fact is that they've been given 1 month to come to a conclusion. We've been going on for 2 months, Mr. Speaker. And it's not that we want to take any hard line with our unions. What we're saying is that our government has been able to go out and negotiate financing and to make cut cost. We have cut the $400 million operating cost by $50 million. And that includes all those additional costs. But those are some of the hard decisions. But to be so disingenuous, or, Mr. Speaker, if you're not being disingenuous, so naive about how the budget process works and what the different terminologies. They all know, Mr. Speaker, capital budgets are not generally funded out of your recurrent expenditure. They did, because they called things capital budgets as a disguise. Our government has not done that, Mr. Speaker. In fact, when we came in, we created 2 new revenue streams. One is the airport tax. We increased the airport tax from $25 to $98. $35 of that money went into a lockbox. The remaining amount of money went into helping put the sink fund and to finance tourism. But the airport project is being funded not from recurrent expenditure, but from that lockbox. We also put the gas tax on, which generates approximately $28 million a year. The loan that we have from the Taiwanese gives us a 5-year moratorium, and we only pay interest on the first 5 years. So that money has been set aside, and it has created approximately $25 million a year that goes into the Ministry of Infrastructure to carry out roadworks. At the same time, the loan has been secured now to spend $41 million US dollars, or approximately 110 million EC dollars, in roadworks that have already commenced. And the second phase of those roadworks are now about to commence. So the fact is, Mr. Speaker, St. Lucia is in a very unique position. The government, having the level of foresight that we did, and accepting the reality of the economic situation, dealt in parallel with the health situation. And I'm very happy that we were able to prove the member from Castries East wrong. And in fact, we were not the worst prepared country in the Caribbean for COVID, but in fact, we were the best prepared country for COVID. And the results are there to speak for that number. But parallel to that, Mr. Speaker, we've been working on the finances of this country. While other people have been running around all over the place, we have secured initially $500 million in loans. We've now secured an additional $275 million in loans and cost cutting. And the last remaining part, which is a critical part, is to hopefully that we get the support of the unions to defer $50 million for the year of $560 million. Or if you want to be accurate, $40 million in wages, 12.5%, to be paid in bonds at a rate of 3%. And we're hoping that we can do that because that is significantly going to help the government at this particular time, Mr. Speaker. Because as I've indicated, the revenue, the money from CDB, the money from the Taiwanese, and the money from the World Bank will not get here until late July, August, and even September. And in June and July, we have the greatest number of bonds and treasury bills coming due. So, Mr. Speaker, the numbers are there to speak for themselves. The government, I think, has done a commendable job in guiding the way for St. Lucia and moving forward. Does that mean, Mr. Speaker, that people are not hurting? It is because we know that people are hurting that we've put the urgency into resolving this issue and being able to finance the budget for the remaining part of the year to take that stress off. And we've decided to take the position of the worst case scenario. Now, if in fact tourism opens up earlier than we think and we're able to generate the additional revenues, we would be happy. We would be ecstatic to pay the workers, the civil servants, back the bond earlier. Nobody wants to take any money from them. The last thing we want to do is that. We're not taking money. We're deferring money. We are deferring payments. And you know, Mr. Speaker, again, you see, this is where members on the opposite side the entire day have shown that they only have politics in their head. That's right. Mr. Speaker, I'm almost convinced in my mind that members on the opposite side actually wanted to believe that we were the worst prepared for COVID and that there would have been a significant health fallout. That they actually want to believe and convince people that this government does not know what it's doing financially and that in fact for true that this country was being mismanaged. But in fact, we're now showing that it's not mismanaged. We're showing that this country was well managed and had a great reputation. And on the basis of that reputation, have been able to go out, Mr. Speaker, and secure the necessary funds to pay for the entire budget. But also, Mr. Speaker, this government has been working hard to develop an aggressive capital program on the promise of what? Building a new St. Lucia. That's what it was about, Mr. Speaker. And building a new St. Lucia, not about just roads and airports, but it was about water. It was about health care. It was about education, $35 million in fixing up schools. And we have another $10 million that we're going to spend this year. In terms of all the things that we're doing, Mr. Speaker, is about improving the quality of life for St. Lucians. We talk about St. Jude's. We didn't come here and cast blame on anyone. Looked at the situation, realized the disaster that was taking place at St. Jude, and in very soon time, we will have a brand new hospital at St. Jude's that I believe will even outshine the OKEU hospital. It is going to be world class. Because you know what, Mr. Speaker? This government has not spoken about the new frontier in Viewport. It is actually building the new frontier for the South. And I want to say to my constituents in Micoud North, in Micoud South, and in Micoud North, I want to say to them that we made a promise that we were going to develop jobs between Ojo Labs, and we've made jobs now in a new call center that's opening up, that we have had jobs. You know, it's amazing, Mr. Speaker, that we continue to demean investors that come to this country. And in the case of DSH, have invested their own money, despite all the efforts on the members on the opposite side, to suggest that he was using CIP money. And all, no, I never said it. He's never been approved for CIP. He's only just been recently approved. He has not won money. No, you have a document that you say is a legitimate document. I've warned you not to make reference to that document in this House. Okay? So all I'm saying to you, Mr. Speaker, this government has moved forward, has attracted world-class investors that I am proud to be affiliated with. DSH, Cabot, all of them. And this idea that something was done wrong, that the NIC, which is in the business of lending and investing money, and they know that because one of the members on their opposite side spoke about that repeatedly. She didn't make the best investments, but spoke about the need to invest by NIC. So $10 million US into 400 acres of land to build a world-class golf course that was supposed to have been built 10 years ago. All of these things are taking place, Mr. Speaker. So the capital projects that we have going on are having zero impact on the recurrent expenditure of the government. Zero. So these funds are not competing with the social programs. These funds are not competing with salaries, Mr. Speaker. They're not even competing with the debt that we have to pay. And this ludicrous idea that is being offered by the members on the opposite side, that it's such a simple thing to take out a magic wand, Mr. Speaker, and convince persons who lent money on the basis of a particular project, and to convince them now to convert that into budgetary support is not going to happen. The CDB doesn't do it. The World Bank doesn't do it. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to conclude today by saying that this is a great moment for St. Lucia. Despite the problems we're having, the members on this side have worked hard, have worked as a team, collectively together, and we are committed to making sure that we rescue St. Lucia. And we're willing to work with everyone. And it's sad, Mr. Speaker, that after attending 3 meetings and making not one contribution at the meeting, that the members on the opposite side, like they have done in the past in the House, decided to pull out. On the basis of what? They're saying, Mr. Speaker, that my government has not given them the opportunity to cut projects. We are sitting here and have put everything on the table, have broken out into 4 different groups, Mr. Speaker, and we eagerly await the report from the Economic Recovery Group on things that we can do to further stimulate the economy. And it's once we've had that report, Mr. Speaker, that we will then pronounce on our economic stimulus program. But you see, the members on the opposite side are such copycats. They heard everybody else talking about economic stimulus. And that's why the member from Castries East and the leader of the opposition decided now to go out and preempt even the Prime Minister and pronounce his own stimulus program. Amazing. And the fact is, Mr. Speaker, we came out because we have a conscience to develop what? A social stabilizing program to assist the vulnerable persons in this society. And Mr. Speaker, I am proud of the fact that on income support alone, that this government, but between the government and the NIC, are going to spend over $100 million. And that does not include the $30 million that we're spending on COVID and the extra money that we're spending on now having to operationalize OKU. But, Mr. Speaker, we have never made an excuse.
On a point of order, can I ask the Minister to kindly indicate to us, after the first month of payments by NIC, how much has been paid and to how many workers? No, it's a legitimate question. Exactly how many persons have been paid and how much?
Thus far, Mr. Speaker, the total amount paid as May 23rd was $5.3 million. Average payout per person was $935. Total number paid as May 23rd was 5,769. Applicants in receipt of relief of 1,000 and over is 2,573. Applicants in receipt of relief less than 100 is 3,196. 45% received over $1,000. The NIC is still processing applications, and there are currently 9,349 applications in process. So the total number of applicants is 9,349 plus 5,769. So that would make it around 14,000 applicants. So, Mr. Speaker, that's for just 1 month. So, Mr. Speaker, as only 1 quarter. Mr. Speaker, the fact is the funds have been made available. And I know that members on the other side are extremely disappointed. One, that we've handled the health crisis as well as we have. And that secondly, Mr. Speaker, members on the opposite side really would have expected that the economy would have completely collapsed, that the government would have been in no position for the same reason that happened today, Mr. Speaker. That's the nature of the beast. The nature of the beast is that it never wants to give an inch. We talk about cooperation, Mr. Speaker. Every opportunity that we invite the members to come and join us, there's always a reason why they don't want to be there. So, Mr. Speaker, the way that they want to do it, they're accustomed to playing on a playing field, and if in fact they're not happy with how the game is going, they kick up their ball and they go away. That is how they've operated always, and I expect no other change. But, Mr. Speaker, members on this side will not be disturbed. We will remain focused on what we have to do, which is to do what? Protect the lives and the health of the people of this country. 2, recover the economy as quickly and as safely as we possibly can, and continue to steer this country in a good direction. And we are not going to give up, Mr. Speaker, on our ambition of building a new St. Lucia and creating jobs for every single person we possibly can in this country. And we make no excuses about it, whether it's in the form of agriculture, whether it's the form of young people in the IT sector, whether it is my young people in the entertainment sector, of which they are waiting for this money to come out as well, which is the $500. But more importantly, those same young people don't want to be paid the $500. They're gladly going to accept it, but what they want, get back to work. That's what everybody in this country wants to do, is to get back to work. And we are committed to helping them fulfill that dream. Every day we work hard to achieve those things. So on that basis, Mr. Speaker, I'm looking forward to the support of all members on this bill. I thought the member from Castries Southeast appropriately put it, that in voting against this bill, is in voting against monies to be able to support the budget, and more importantly, to continue to support the social programs, and particularly the informal sector persons who need their income. So on that note, Mr. Speaker, I thank you very much.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, Mr. Speaker, before we vote on this matter, I want for the record, the Prime Minister has assured us that he has signed a warrant. And I need to ask the Prime Minister, and for the record, if the warrant needs to be gazetted, and if so, when was it gazetted? Because to become law, it has to be gazetted. The Prime Minister said that he did sign a warrant. Can he please inform this House, before we vote, since he's not making a copy available, does it have to be gazetted? And if so,
Honorable Member, Honorable Prime Minister, I am not in a position to answer the questions, but are you prepared to answer this question now? Okay. Honorable members, the question is that A, Parliament authorizes the Minister of Finance to borrow the sum of SDR 21,400,000 or US 29 million by way of a rapid credit facility loan from the International Monetary Fund for the purpose of capital and recurrent expenditure. B, the loan is repayable, 1, at a 0% rate interest, at a 0% interest rate inclusive of a 5.5-year grace period with a final maturity of 10 years, and 2, semi-annually through a standing authorization to the International Monetary Fund to debit St. Lucia's XDR account with the amount of all financial obligations to the International Monetary Fund for the rapid credit facility loan as the financial obligations fall due. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I've already put a question that has been answered. Sorry about it. Bills, Honorable Prime Minister. Honorable Prime Minister, bills. Honorable Prime Minister, bills.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the first reading of a bill shortly entitled Citizenship by Investment Amendment.
Citizenship by Investment Amendment.
Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move for the suspension of Standing Order 43.2 to allow the bill to go through its remaining stages at this 48.2, my apologies, thank you very much, to allow the bill to go through its remaining stages at this sitting.
Honorable members, the question is that Standing Order 48.2 be suspended in order to allow the Honorable Minister to proceed with the remaining stages of the bill at this sitting. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Proceed, Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the purpose of the Citizenship by Investment Amendment Bill is to amend the Citizenship by Investment Act, Cap 120. Oh, my apologies. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move for the second reading of the bill shortly entitled Citizenship by Investment Amendment. The purpose of the Citizenship by Investment Amendment Bill, the bill, is to amend the Citizenship by Investment Act, Cap 1.20. These modifications are necessary in order to inject a greater element of efficiency and flexibility into the Citizenship by Investment program. The program, and to make it more attractive to applicants, thereby allowing it to remain competitive with other Citizenship by Investment programs within the region. The bill seeks to expand the category of persons that fall within the meaning of the qualifying dependent under the Act. First, the age of the child of the applicant or his or her spouse who is considered a qualifying dependent is increased from 18 years to 21 years, and a new category of qualifying dependent is provided for, namely an unmarried sister or brother of the applicant who is below 18 years of age and who has received the consent of his or her parent or guardian to make an application for citizenship by investment. The first circulated copy of the bill included an amendment to Section 24 of the Act to stipulate that the names of the citizens under the 17 years should not be published. However, this was proposed amendment has been deleted and no longer forms part of the bill. As such, the requirements for the annual report to contain information of the names, addresses, and the nationalities of successful applicants and any qualifying dependents included in the application continues to apply. With respect to the approval, denial, or delay of the application, the bill amends the Act to provide that the current 5-year maximum time period on the categories of persons who may be eligible as a qualifying dependent be removed in respect of a child of the citizen born or a spouse of the citizen that was married after the application for citizenship by investment was granted. Allow an applicant to request an extension of time to pay the fees related to the application and the qualifying investment, and to give the board the discretion to grant an extension of time for more than 90 days as currently obtains in the legislation, if unforeseen circumstances exist. The minister is empowered to make regulations with the approval of the Cabinet for waiver of fees. The proposed amendments will allow for the broadening of the categories of qualifying dependents, thereby creating an incentive to applicants and authorized agents. It should be noted that the expansion of the categories of qualifying dependents will not in any way affect the quality of the due diligence checks undertaken by the Citizenship by Investment Unit. Thank you.
Honorable members, the question is that the Citizenship by Investment Amendment Bill be read a second time. Honorable member, cast yourself.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I commence, I really want to point out, Mr. Speaker, that we've had this discussion in Parliament before. When there's no necessity for us to suspend the standing orders, and for a bill which became public less than 3 days, at least not even public, that was shared with the opposition not more than 3 or 4 days ago, to have to go through all the stages. It is almost midnight. The House is meeting again next week, Tuesday, and we are suspending the standing orders to allow the bill to go through all its stages at 10 to 12, Mr. Speaker. We've all agreed to suspend standing orders to allow this is unacceptable practice. It has happened in the past. Mr. Speaker, you addressed a workshop of the Commonwealth where this matter was discussed, and there was an understanding that such is poor parliamentary practice. I understand there are times when it's necessary to do it. There are times when it is necessary to do it. But, Mr. Speaker, you cannot tell me at 10 to 12, with the House meeting in less than a week time, we need to suspend the standing orders to allow this to go through all three stages, Mr. Speaker. I can very well take my hour, Mr. Speaker, and speak, Mr. Speaker, because this is really it's certainly unacceptable in the House, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I know they have some colleagues on the other side who have to travel very far. And, Mr. Speaker, I will attempt to be as short as possible, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister, the Minister speaks of those changes are necessary to make the CIP more efficient and to make it more attractive, Mr. Speaker. In my view, this reflects the continued confusion and chaos in the CIP, Mr. Speaker. Over the last 4 years, Mr. Speaker, this government has chopped and slashed and burned the CIP legislation. in a vain attempt to make it attractive. From day one in this honorable house, we said to the Prime Minister and to the members opposite that you should build the product. You should make it attractive. Instead, the Prime Minister said the way to go is to make us the cheapest there is. And one of the first things this government did was to make St. Lucia the cheapest CIP destination in the world. And now we've gotten even cheaper. Even cheaper. There's a strange irony in it all. St. Kitts is more expensive than us, Antigua is more expensive than us, and they're all doing better than us. No, it's more St. Kitts is more expensive, Antigua is more expensive, and they're all doing better than us.
Mr. Speaker, on the point of hallucination, if the member would allow me.
To say what? I'll just take it back, whatever you want me to take that. Just to proceed, because everybody is...
Antigua's not cheaper. We are cheaper.
Honorable
Antigua
Prime
is much
Minister.
cheaper than we are.
Well, I know Antigua is not
Minister.
less than $100 US.
For a family.
Honorable members, that's not how it is. That's how you're giving away.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to say that, first of all, I think it's very unfair to characterize that we've tried to become the cheapest. We've become the most efficient. The second thing is that we are not cheaper. We are not cheaper than Antigua. Antigua is $100,000 for a family. We are $150,000 for a family.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is one who's known to just bang figures about and say things. I've raised $900 million, $2 billion in investment. I have no reason to believe anything he says when it comes to figures. But I'll say to you, Mr. Speaker, when we became $100,000, the Prime Minister boasted that we're now as cheap as Dominica. He said he never said it. Prime Minister, you don't want me to embarrass you tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, despite reducing St. Lucia to $100,000, Dominica continued to be performing much better than us. We continue to be the worst performers in the region. And we slash and change, Mr. Speaker. There is no certainty in the program. There is no confidence in the program. The program has become like a bacchanal, a free-for-all, Mr. Speaker. And the once proud brand that St. Lucia was has been destroyed, Mr. Speaker. Destroyed. And Mr. Speaker, when you go through these changes, and I want to just go through them quickly, Mr. Speaker, you realize, and you have to ask the question, what are we all about in the CIP program? Let me just go through a few of them with you, Mr. Speaker. We are changing the maximum age of a child who may qualify as a dependent from 18 years old to 21 years old. Previously, the legislation said the maximum age was 18. Why are we bringing it up to 21? Explain that to me. Why? To make St. Lucia more attractive? Let's go on, Mr. Speaker, and I want to go quickly. I can see some members watching me rather anxiously. Mr. Speaker, we had previously the maximum age by which a child may normally be considered to be a dependent was no more than 25 years. We've now raised it, family of four, to 30 years. So somebody 28 years old can still be considered a dependent right now. And why are we doing that again? To make the program more efficient, Mr. Speaker. Before, for you to be a dependent of such age, you had to show that you were in an educational institution, that you were still at university and depending on your parents. We've removed that. Removed that. So you can be 29 years old, you're not at school, and then you're considered a dependent. And we are making the program more efficient, Mr. Speaker. Section 2E, Mr. Speaker. We had an age, minimum age for a parent who can be to qualify as a dependent. We had it at 65 years old. This government is now reducing it to 55 years old. We thought 65 was the age by which people attain retirement. So once you reach, above the age of 65, you can qualify. It's now reduced to 55 years. And we're told that to make the program more efficient, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is just ridiculous, Mr. Speaker. It's ridiculous. Let me give you another one. And I'm skipping some of them because I don't want to go through all of them. And this one really blows me away. Before, or in fact now, Mr. Speaker, we are giving people extra time, and I need to read it for you. It is 36(4)(b). Yeah. 36(4)(b). The powers to the board to grant an extension of time for the applicant to pay fees and a qualifying investment for a period not exceeding 90 days. So we're now saying to people, we know you can't really pay the fees and the qualifying investment. So we're now giving you extra time for you to be able to pay those fees. Now think about it. Somebody is applying to be a citizen for economic citizenship, and they have to show that they're investing, either through donation or other means. You would expect that those persons would have the resources to do so. You would expect that. Because the whole nature of it is that you are inviting persons of high net worth. And we're saying we're going to extend the time. Sorry?
Honorable Member, page 7.
Yeah.
Page 7.
Page 7. 4B. Where an application is approved under subsection 1A, the board shall notify the applicant of the approval within 50 days of the request. Yes. Sorry, my apologies. Mr. Speaker, you're taking it on credit. And I've just highlighted 4 of the changes, and I can, Mr. Speaker, probably go through the list of them. The list of them, Mr. Speaker. And may I just point out, Honorable Member for Miko South, whether there is not an error with the drafting. 36(1)(a). Well, I have my, that's page 7, where it says, is a child born or legally adopted after the application is made by the citizen? B is page 7 for 1A, because you're now deleting and moving. Whether that word "and" after citizen should not be "or," because the "and" suggests they must qualify all 3 conditions. Yes. 1A. Right, and then say, if the board is satisfied that the qualifying dependent is a child born or legally adopted after the application was made by the citizen. B is the spouse of the citizen and was married after the application was made by the citizen. And C was a defined. It suggests you need to meet all 3 conditions. And whether that "and" should not be an "or." And you may wish to ask your legal drafts people whether that's not an error. It should be "or" instead of "and." And again, these are the reasons why we should not be rushing the legislation. It's right. It's supposed to be "and."
Only "and" is for B and C, it's not for A. Please stand for
Okay. My advice is that it probably should be "or." But if you read it, it can't be "and." Okay. You're the minister. So, Mr. Speaker, let's come back to why those changes are being made. Why? Why are we having to bastardize the CIP again? Now, another reason why I'm not going to say too much, Mr. Speaker, is because there will have to be a review of the CIP. A St. Lucia Labour Party government cannot allow this bastardization to just continue. We will have to review the CIP. We have to. The CIP right now has no transparency, and there's no accountability in the CIP. There is none, Mr. Speaker. And I know what I'm speaking about, Mr. Speaker. There's no transparency and accountability. Have you heard any statement from the minister in his statement about the legal settlements that this CIP has had to go through? Legal settlements and the cost to the CIP to settle those matters. Have you heard anything about the appointment of Henley and Partners? The same Henley and Partners who days before the last election, a particular gentleman made statements about our CIP in Central that it was the worst CIP. We had not yet received, or if my memory serves me right, certainly when I left as chairman, we had not yet received one single application in March 2016. By June, they may have received one or two, but he had already judged our CIP to the worst CIP. And Henley and Partners were known to be in cohorts with Cambridge Analytica, financing election campaigns in the Caribbean. Financing election campaigns. And that same gentleman right now is negotiating a deal with the government of St. Lucia to market our CIP. Did the Prime Minister say that? And in that deal, the government of St. Lucia, the CIP, is actually paying Henley upfront a fee to start marketing our CIP. Now, we're talking about transparency in the CIP. And I won't say too much tonight, Mr. Speaker, because the right time will come when a lot has to be said. No, not tonight. No, people are really listening. We'll have enough time to say it. Mr. Speaker, an employee in charge of due diligence in the CIP was fired because he insisted he wanted to do due diligence on a particular institution that had applied to work in the CIP, and he was told to approve it. And because he did not, he was sent home, and he's suing right now. Mr. Speaker, I'm just giving you a couple of examples. To date, we have never been told what was the legal settlement with Range. The member from Ansari Canary said it's about 30 million. Somebody else said it was about 22 million. We've never been told exactly what was the settlement with Range.
Speaker, on a point of order. Now,
Mr. Speaker.
On a point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Indicate the point of order, sir.
I have never said that this government pays Range $30 million to settle any case or to settle any agreement. So I want the member from Castries South to withdraw the statement, because he certainly cannot prove that I have said that we have settled it for $33 million. I mean, there he goes again, misrepresenting the truth. Now, I know it's late, and I know that maybe he has not taken his medication, and things are getting, he's forgetting, but Mr. Speaker, he needs to withdraw that.
Mr. Speaker, I have raised this matter in this House. The member has raised the same issue. I have actually read his direct words on This Makes Me Mad with Andre Paul to prove him wrong. But he's standing up again today to say, I cannot prove it. You really need to call Judy for true, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, so there's a lot going on in the CIP, and these are the reasons that are affecting the integrity and the reputation of the CIP. And we find again the CIP being slashed and burned in an attempt to make it attractive to raise monies. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell you, I can sympathize with the member from Miko South. We need to raise monies from all the sources that we can. But we always have a problem in this country, and the people of Central will tell you, they have a burning issue with accepting what's the true account of how much money has been raised by the CIP. Now the member from Miko South is convinced that he has provided us with a full account. But if the member had followed the law and what the legislation said, we would not have been faced with that problem. If he had followed the law, and you know what he did? He changed the law. So he wouldn't have to come to the House to say how much money was raised and get approvals for his expenditure. He changed the CIP legislation, so that wouldn't have to be done. And he will always be haunted by the people of St. Lucia having no trust in what he says about the CIP and its money. And we begged him, Prime Minister, the law says you need to come to the House. Just do it. Let people know how much money was raised and how it was spent. And what's making it even worse, and I say that there's a problem of trust with this government. The last report of the CIP that was tabled in this House, they were missing information that the law requires that to be in there. I stood up, Mr. Speaker, on a point of order and pointed out that those pieces of information were not included. Somebody came in for one sheet with some of the information and circulated it. And to this day, the last report of the CIP to this Honorable House does not contain all the information that the law says it has to contain. And in the previous version of this legislation that was circulated, there was an attempt to delete from the law what information has to be put in. And I noted this revised version, and the member mentioned it. They withdrew it, and they took it out. And I can tell you that St. Lucia would have been in grave danger if we had taken it out, because the European Union is very clear about transparency of the CIP programs and what information must be made available. And whoever advised you, Honorable Member for Mico South, to withdraw that deletion from the legislation and keep it as it is, did a very good thing. Whoever told you to do that, because the EU has made it very clear from CIP programs the kind of information they want made public. In fact, if I look in my notes, I'll actually see the name of the publication, the Report on Investor Citizenship and Residence Schemes in the European Union. The European Commission makes it very clear. So, this is a desperate attempt, member, for Mico South, a very desperate attempt. If you had maybe just listened, you said you would never listen to me. I can never give you advice, so it's up to you. But you wouldn't find yourself in this position where you are now, where you are desperate and you are vulgarizing the CIP legislation in an attempt to get a few more applications. And there's another burning issue, the issues of bonds. And we don't have a lot of time tonight for me to explain to you the potential scheme there can be with bonds. But all I will say to you is to be very careful who you involve with in the sale of those bonds under the CIP and how it is done. And I trust you know enough people who will also give you the same advice. And I noted that you slashed the value of the bonds from 500 to 250. It's like a corner shop having a closing down sale. And I hope you're very cautious for the sake of St. Lucia how this is managed. And at another time, I'll probably have more time to explain. And I'm sure you may have, you would have known by now. And I hope you show the care and attention that this program has been severely affected by all the chopping and changing and all the cutting of price and addition of this and removal of this, that it has really destroyed the integrity of the program, really affected the integrity. Mr. Speaker, the member says, stop it to another union, don't tell him how to run the affairs of government. The member from Mico South said, stop it to another entity, don't tell him how to run the affairs of government. And I can only wish him well. And I will close by saying that the St. Lucia Labour Party will review the CIP. We will review every single application to ensure that it met the standards that are required, that the required fees were paid, the required due diligence was completed, Mr. Speaker, and that the St. Lucia CIP is restored to what it was originally conceived to be, a program of the highest integrity, confidence, accountability, and transparency. Thank you very much.
Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me deal with the more salient points to begin with. So the reason, Mr. Speaker, that the extension of time is requested, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure that members on the opposite side would know that the CIP program around the world has difficulties in getting monies transferred to accounts. And many times, Mr. Speaker, we have found ourselves where applicants have had difficulty in getting their monies transferred. Past full due diligence. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we had a gentleman who is on public boards in America who made an application, and it took over 3 months to eventually get their funds finally approved. And so it's for examples like that, Mr. Speaker, that we had to do, ask for the caveat that the board would make the decision with the evidence of a difficulty. So this is not a carte blanche. It's not the minister giving this approval. This is the board that's making these judgments. The attempt here, Mr. Speaker, is in constantly reviewing our program compared to other programs. And we've agreed that we're not going to, in any way, try to use price to buy the market. And it's also very unfair on the member from Castries South, and I know what he's attempting to do, to compare Dominica or St. Kitts to St. Lucia. St. Kitts has the oldest program since 1987. Dominica has been in existence since 1991. Their natural advantages that they have already, in most cases, approved over 12,000 citizens that they themselves act as ambassadors in getting other people to join the program. So it's a very unfair comparison. But to compare, the fact is that St. Lucia, compared to Grenada and compared to to Antigua, has been very competitive in terms of the numbers. Now, Mr. Speaker, the last time that we got into this debate with regards to whether, in fact, the government fulfilled its obligations under the law in transparency in this House, we ended up in a very difficult situation, and I put you in it, Mr. Speaker, in a compromised position. And again, I didn't have the opportunity then, so let me say it now. I apologize, and I recognize that you are the person in charge of the House, so I was wrong. But at that time, Mr. Speaker, I was at pains to be able to show to the member from Castries South that, in fact, that he was wrong, and he's wrong again tonight. He can say it as many times as he wants to, Mr. Speaker, but the facts are the facts. All of the information was in the estimates. We showed him where it was, the total amount, and we showed him exactly how the money was being spent. We came to the House, Mr. Speaker, and we said, in the absence of an economic fund being established, that the closest thing that we could do in fulfilling the obligations was to put the money into the consolidated fund. Because once it was in a consolidated fund, there was accountability for the total number of money, verified, and secondly, to extract it from the consolidated fund, it had to be in the appropriations bill. Couldn't spend it otherwise. And it was clearly highlighted in there. But you know, Mr. Speaker, I'm coming to see now that this is the norm for my colleague. And what's interesting is that he wants to talk about, the member that is from Castries South, wants to talk about integrity and having to do the right thing from the EU. The reason why the names were not going to be included, and it was only for persons, Mr. Speaker, under the age of 17, was to protect the rights of a minor. That's why it was being done. And the reason why it was kept in, Mr. Speaker, because whenever there is a mistake that's made or somebody has been in breach of the agreement after receiving their citizenship, and it has happened on one case, where that the citizenship has to be rescinded, we would have to publish the name. So if we're going to have to publish the name once the person is being rescinded, then it was advised that we should include the name on the approval. And that's why the change was made. But there was nothing deliberate on our part to disguise it. We were simply trying to protect the rights of minors. But you know, Mr. Speaker, the member from Castries South needs to be reminded that the persons that ran the most non-transparent and broke every advice of good governance was their government. When they appointed him as the chairman of the Invest Solution, of CIP. I mean, Mr. Speaker, this is a gentleman that was the High Commissioner in the UK, involved in a very visible and a very well documented exchange of diplomacy, in exchange of receiving benefits, and I'm being very careful, Mr. Speaker, to help a Saudi billionaire get diplomacy. And these are not by my words, these are by the judge in the case. Not by my words, Mr. Speaker. By all means.
Mr. Speaker, this is a gentleman that a judge said, I receive benefits, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, you keep allowing this to happen.
Honorable members, this matter, I am not sure this matter has been settled, but I know there's a matter.
Because you warned him on numerous occasions to not go there, Mr. Speaker. Because one day I will see the benefits he received and from who.
Yeah. Honorable member, if the matter is before the court, I know there was a matter before the court. I'm not sure what the status now, but if it is still before the court, then let's...
The matter before the court is one of defamation, right? And the fact is, what's interesting is that we're in a defamation case, and the member would have defamed himself in the case. But it's very, very interesting. And that will all be for another day, Mr. Speaker. But nonetheless to say, Mr. Speaker, it really is the pot calling the kettle black. You're telling me, Mr. Speaker, that the member was...
Honorable member.
Who?
Continue, Mr. Prime Minister.
Who?
Continue, Mr. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the fact is that the member was the worst choice to be made as chairman. And I won't even get in... No, it doesn't eat me. I felt sorry for St. Lucia. Because the fact is that the program could have never been taken credibly, given that you had a person that everybody knew was involved in a diplomatic affair, and also that everybody knew was going to be running for government. And the proof that he is here tells you that we were right. And the fact is, no, Mr. Okay? And that is the fact. If there's one person that should have never been the chairman of CIP, should have been the member of Castries South. Now, the fact is the member continues to talk because the fact is that their government gave 2 exclusivities to 2 companies based on a regional geographic area. And you know what they did, Mr. Speaker? Regardless of whether those companies produced a file or not, they got paid. So I want to know why on earth, and then you know what was also interesting, Mr. Speaker? An automatic renewal clause. Okay, so Mr. Speaker, if in fact you know that there are several companies out there, why wouldn't you want to work with all the companies? Why would you give anybody an exclusivity? Why wouldn't you understand the simple concept that other companies are working on a global basis and that these companies are the greatest competitors against each other, Mr. Speaker? So you're talking about competitors. So why would I now go and sell a citizen to St. Lucia, knowing that the company that I'm competing against is going to get 10% commission? Would you do that, Mr. Speaker? Does that make any sense to you, Mr. Speaker? But no, they're so quick, Mr. Speaker, to draw and criticize what we're attempting to do, where we've come in, reviewed the program, and you know, Mr. Speaker, I am so disappointed that the members from the opposite side would continue to demean the good names of the persons who are on the board, and particularly the staff. The CEO of CIP, unlike the previous CEO, is well qualified, has been involved in due diligence.
Who was the previous?
Ask him. In fact, what he should do is he should ask who was the husband and what his relationship is.
Continue, Honorable
So,
Prime
Mr.
Minister.
Speaker, the fact is that these are cheap attempts to continue to persuade the public of St. Lucia that we're not being transparent. I pride myself on the fact, Mr. Speaker, that we have been very transparent. We've accounted for every single dollar. We've accounted for every single passport. The member makes the reference to the fact that the board papers came in. When he brought it up and we realized that he was correct, immediately that same day, Mr. Speaker, and you would know that the amendment was brought in and all the names were provided, to suggest for one moment, and again, that he believes that all the names were not included, again, is in suggesting ill repute on members on this side, which is something we're supposed to go away from. But he can't help himself, Mr. Speaker. That's the only argument. The only argument is to constantly throw enough, you know what, on the wall, Mr. Speaker, hoping that some of it is going to stick. Whether it's true or not, they have absolutely no evidence to support anything and any allegation that they're making. And you know what's incredible, Mr. Speaker? The last time we were in this House having this discussion, Mr. Speaker, the last time that we were in the House having this discussion, Mr. Speaker, we ended up in a big back and forth. And the frustration for me is that it was written in black and white. I don't know how to provide any more evidence that we could to show them that they were wrong. And despite that, imagine that, Mr. Speaker, that the member from Castries South would find himself at this hour of the night inventing the truth again. But you see, Mr. Speaker, I'm convinced that members on the opposite side live in a world of their own fiction. That when in fact they don't like what is happening, they create the output that they want to justify their argument. That I am the most arrogant person. That I'm the person that's doing all these things, that I'm misleading everybody. There's no evidence, zero evidence of what they're trying to suggest, Mr. Speaker. And the fact is what I am very comfortable in, Mr. Speaker, is I know for a fact that the public of this country will measure us on the work that we've achieved. And that they will see through all of these allegations, false allegations by members on the other side. I certainly, Mr. Speaker, would not want to be on their side, to have to defend the track record that they've had, and then to try to find fault in what we've been able to achieve. So, Mr. Speaker, on that note, I would like to certainly say to everybody and to reiterate to everyone, we are not in any way...
Honourable members, continue on the program.
You know, Mr. Speaker, and again, I'm going to finish on this last note. That, and I will bring the document back, Mr. Speaker. I'll actually get it from Hansard, Mr. Speaker. I came to the House and explained everything that happened with range. I showed all the numbers. That the range, Mr. Mohammed, that we reimbursed him the money that he paid for the land. It was about $3.6 million that he paid for the land. He did. That's all he paid. He paid $3 EC a square foot. 6 days before the election. Can you imagine, Mr. Speaker? 6 days before the general
members,
election.
allow the Prime Minister to complete.
$3 EC a square foot. We paid him back exactly what he paid. Okay? In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, in addition to that, Range brought $22 million worth of files to the table, and we paid him his commission for his files. So again, the government of St. Lucia retained the monies which it did not have, okay? And we paid the 10%. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, we reimbursed him, I believe it like $1.5 million, but I will get the exact amount for you because I came to the House and reported to it for his architectural drawings. But you know, Mr. Speaker, the point is, Mr. Speaker, I came to the House. But sadly, Mr. Speaker, the member from Castries South knows all too well what the transaction that took place, because he is the one who put the deal together. He is the one who signed the deal 6 days before the election. Who does that? There was no cabinet. Can you imagine, Mr. Speaker? Parliament had been paroled. The Parliament had been paroled, Mr. Speaker. Okay? And the government signed the deal to sell the land 6 days before the election. Mr. Speaker, talk about unethical. Talk about bad governance. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? Told nobody.
Honourable members.
What was going on. So, Mr. Speaker, it is very difficult for me, Mr. Speaker, to honestly take members, and particularly the member...
Honourable members. Honourable Member Anstlery. Honourable Member Anstlery. I need the Prime Minister to wrap up now.
Mr. Speaker, it's very difficult for me to take members on the opposite side, and particularly the member of Castries South when it comes to, because he's so emotionally involved. This is like his baby, and I get it, Mr. Speaker. He doesn't want anybody to invent and to disrupt his child. But the fact is, Mr. Speaker, that even if he was in government, he would have had to have amended, make many of the same, maybe not the same amendments, but he would have had to amend. Because every day, everybody else around the world is amending their CIP programs. And until we can get to the place where we can get the OECS governments to agree on a singular CIP program. And we continue to advocate for that, Mr. Speaker. I have been asking, I will continue to ask, and we will continue to lead the way, Mr. Speaker, because we believe it's the right thing. Because the citizenship is not just that of St. Lucia, the citizenship is of the OACS. And he's right. Other members don't want to do it. But it's the right thing to do, because in the absence of doing it, we're going to continue to go down to the bottom. Because we're competing against ourselves, not against the rest of the world. But one day we were going to get that, Mr. Speaker. We're going to get there, Mr. Speaker. So I just want to say, Mr. Speaker, I'm hopefully that I've answered the genuine questions that the members on the opposite side had. But I would really suggest to the member, particularly from Castries South, that he should really be cautious, because he certainly has no good standing. He has been wrong on every single point that he's brought to this House on scene. Every single one that he's been wrong. And we have shown the evidence and proven the fact that he's wrong. He's not being genuine. But anyway, Mr. Speaker, on that point, I'm looking forward to the support.
Honourable members.
I'm looking forward to the support of the members of the other side. And I want to let the member also know that, you see, I sat quietly, because I could have got up every single second like I have done in the past to contest what you're going to say. And I've chosen that I will sit and listen to what you have to say and rebut it. But I can say to you, the facts are on our side. That you are wrong. I have proven him time and time again to be wrong. And I assure you that in the future, that trend of success will continue, because members on this side are transparent and are focused on the right issues. Members on the opposite side, Mr. Speaker, continue to only be focused on one thing, and that is politics, not the people. Put the people first. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable members, the question is that a Citizenship by Investment Amendment Bill be read a second time. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
An act to amend the Citizenship by Investment Act, Cap 1.20.
Sorry for the bad people. I didn't want to tell them shoot. That's why I
Honourable members, let's review the legislation. Let's review the legislation. Clause 2.
Interpretation.
Clause 2 stands part of the bill.
Aye.
Clause 3.
Amendment of Section 2.
Clause 3 stands part of the bill.
Aye.
Clause 4.
Amendment of Section 36.
Clause 4 stands part of the bill.
Aye.
Clause 5.
Amendment of Section 40.
Clause 5 stands part of the bill.
Aye.
Clause 1.
Short title.
Clause 1 stands part of the bill. Honourable members, the question is that the committee rises and the bill be reported. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
As many as of a contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Honourable members, I beg to report that the Citizenship by Investment Amendment Bill went through committee stage with no amendments. Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the committee be adopted and the bill be read a third time and passed.
Honourable members, the question is that the report of the committee be adopted and that the Citizenship by Investment Amendment Bill be read a third time and passed. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Honourable.
Be it enacted by the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the House of Assembly and the Senate of St. Lucia, and by the authority of the same as follows. This act may be cited as the Citizenship by Investment Amendment Act 2020.
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, again, want to thank you and the staff for a very long day and for all their patience and their level of professionalism. I also want to particularly thank the members from NTN that have been here covering this event all of today, and also the members from the police force and your members and your staff downstairs. At this point, Mr. Speaker, I move that the House stand adjourned until Tuesday, June the 2nd.
Honorable members, the question is that this House do stand adjourned until Tuesday, June 2nd, 2020. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Sitting adjourned.
Thank you for staying with the broadcast. We've come to the conclusion of the sitting of Parliament, where we saw a number of papers being laid by the various ministers. 3 motions were also presented by the Honorable Prime Minister and Minister for Finance, Economic Growth, Job Creation, External Affairs and the Public Service. The first one, be it resolved that Parliament further extend for an additional period commencing from the first day of June 2020 and ending on the 30th of September 2020, in accordance with Section 17(6) of the Constitution of St. Lucia, Cap 1.01, the Constitution of St. Lucia, extension of resolution of Parliament approving declaration of state of emergency, passed as statutory instrument number 60 of 2020 that extended the state of emergency for an additional period commencing from the 27th of April 2020 and ending on the 31st day of May 2020. The second motion, be it resolved that Parliament authorizes the Minister for Finance to borrow by means of advances sums not exceeding $85 million from commercial banks for a period of 6 months from the date hereof, which sums shall be charged on. Be it resolved that Parliament authorizes the Minister for Finance to borrow the sum of $29 million by way of a rapid credit facility loan from the International Monetary Fund for the purpose of capital and recurrent expenditure. The loan is repayable at a 0% interest rate, inclusive of a 5.5-year grace period, with a final maturity of 10 years, and semi-annually through a standing authorization to the International Monetary Fund to debit St. Lucia's XDR account with the amount of all financial obligations to the International Monetary Fund for the Rapid Credit Facility loan as the financial obligations fall due. Lastly, the Honorable Prime Minister and Minister for Finance, Economic Growth, Job Creation and External Affairs and the Public Service, the Honorable Alan Chastney, laid the Citizenship by Investment Amendment Bill. He indicated that this was in an effort to inject a greater element of efficiency and transparency so as to attract investors and remain competitive in the market, and that is for the CIP program. The bill went through the first, second, and third reading. The House has been suspended until Tuesday, June 2nd, 2020. Please tune in on Thursday, 29th May 2020 for the sitting of the Senate. Once again, thank you for staying tuned with the broadcast. Until next time.